It's now 10:30, and we'll wait a minute or two as well, just to let a few stragglers in. But I'll let people come in now. So let's admit all. Good morning, Adrian. Good morning, Chris. Good morning, Peter. Good morning, Simon. Welcome, welcome, welcome. If you've just joined, if you could please mute, that'll be absolutely fantastic. Just to cut out any background noise, and we can let our presenters speak. Good morning, Steve. Good morning, Trish. Good morning, William. More and more people joining. Good morning. Good morning, David. Good morning, Andrew. If you've just joined, please, if you could mute, please, that'll be fantastic. And good morning, JQ. And good morning, Kirsty. So we'll leave it another minute or two just to pick up a few stragglers. If you have joined, please mute. That'll be great. Thank you. And then we can start the session. So let's see. David, I'm going to mute you if that's all right. So morning, Alan. Morning, Ian. Morning, Sasha. Okay. Thank you for joining, everybody. Let's have a look. Ian, if you could mute, that would be great. Thanks. Just to cut that. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. Morning, Sasha. Okay, there we go. Fantastic. Okay, so it's now 10:32. First of all, welcome everybody to Pension Playpen and our regular Tuesday coffee morning event. We are now recording, so can we have a thumbs up? William, JQ, everybody's happy to record. Ian, thank you very much. And we will be introducing you to David and Shailin from the PPF as advertised. Henry has agreed to host, and we have a small presentation, I think, which Henry will explain. But today is all about debate and questions. So I hope you've come armed with lots of questions. As I say, we are recording. And if you want to ask a question, as usual, please raise a hand in the usual format, or indeed make a comment in the chat. But as you know, Henry and I will bring you in to get some interaction if that's possible. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to Henry and enjoy the session, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. I won't say anything further than that because you already hosted that bit. And it's great to have Shailin and David on the call. I'm going to hand straight over to you guys. Away you go.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much. First of all, just to say thank you very much for having us here. We do seem to be a bit more in the spotlight than we've been for a while, and doing quite a lot of these. So it's great to have the opportunity to have these sort of conversations. Just by way of personal introductions, I'm David Taylor. I'm Executive Director and General Counsel here at the PPF, been here almost since the start of the PPF. And I have various responsibilities that include strategy and policy and the pension protection levy, as well as legal. Shailin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for having us both along to this morning's event. I've come down with my cup of coffee, so but thank you all for making the time to join us. I'm the Chief Actuary at the Pension Protection Fund. Just to echo David's comments, I hope we can have a good chat about some of the challenges facing our industry. I think it would be naive of any one person or organization to believe they have all the answers. I think DB pensions is, as much as anything, a game of whack-a-mole. No sooner you think you solve one problem, then another one crops up. And I guess the best way to, thank you, Henry, the best way to play a game of whack-a-mole is to have as many people helping out to try and whack the moles as possible. So looking forward to an interesting discussion. And my colleague David's got a few slides prepared, which he will kick off with, and then I'll join him a bit later. Over to you, David.
Thanks. I mean, very conscious, first of all, that we have an audience of people who are very into this stuff, so we don't want to tell you things that you all already know, and also we want plenty of time for questions. But we did think it was important just to set a little bit of context on this, particularly to go back prior to the Mansion House speech and so on, and just to talk a bit about where we've come from on this. You know, the PPF has, for as long as I can remember, really been thinking, okay, well, we've been successful in our current mission. Are there other things, other uses that the sort of the public good that is the PPF could be put to? And I guess that was particularly drawn out in the PPF review led by Leslie Titcombe. It's actually formerly a DWP review that came out at the end of last year, which came out relatively quietly and didn't make a particularly big splash at the time. Covered all the things you would expect in a departmental review. But one of the things that Leslie said was, recognising that PPF had reached a point of maturity as an organisation with a strong financial position and a mature operating model, and recognise the skills and capabilities that the PPF has in investment, clearly, but also in what we talk about as scheme delivery, the process of getting pension schemes into the PPF, particularly the success of our panel system, where we work with firms that have done a lot of PPF cases and kind of know the ropes, and we can work very closely with to make things work faster. And so effectively we have a strong track record delivering against that existing role. And so it was in that report that Leslie was saying that, that we should explore with government how we could use our capabilities and skills to the wider public benefit if the government wants. And I think that's the critical point here. We don't make policy. That's for government and Parliament. We certainly don't claim to have all the answers. But as Shannon's already said, I think we can all agree that there are plenty of challenges out there. So to pick off a few that will be very familiar, we have in the DB world, we have a universe that is very fragmented with a long tail of very small schemes. Something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about in my role with the levy over the years. We have improved scheme funding, more schemes looking to de-risk and buy out, and then over the whole course of the existence of the PPF, the trend towards schemes reducing their allocations to productive assets as they go on their de-risking journey. But we know that sort of behind those headline numbers, the picture is a lot more varied. You've got some schemes kind of left behind, the stressed schemes, lots of enduring challenges for small schemes, including in relation to what happens when they try to buy out. So I think that does then, that's kind of the before the Mansion House speech. So maybe if we can go on to the next slide, Georgie. I mean, I'm really not going to dwell on this because this will all be very familiar. Jeremy Hunt's speech of the 10th of July this year, in which he talked about setting some governmental priorities, but in the context of 3 golden rules: securing the best outcome for pension savers, prioritising a strong and diversified gilt market, and strengthening the UK's position as a leading financial centre to create wealth and fund public services. And against the backdrop of those 3 golden rules, obviously the ambition to drive substantial investment into productive finance assets. Obviously, within that speech, there are a wide range of propositions, a lot of them in the DC world. We're not here to talk about those particularly today, but more to focus in on the call for evidence that was launched on DB. DWP saw as it says on the slide, views on a range of options. I think I'd probably put the first two bullets there in the opposite order. So what could be done within the existing scheme, within the existing framework, to encourage schemes to invest more in productive finance within as their existing schemes, whether that could be incentivized by making it easier to extract surplus from those schemes. The question of whether, if schemes are to be encouraged to do that, they would need to help them along their way. They would need to be backed up by a higher level of benefits than the PPF currently guarantees, whether that would be a guarantee of full benefits, and then whether or not that would be in exchange for some sort of opt-in system for where schemes could pay a higher levy in order to have that full level of benefits guaranteed. So there's those, and then there's the question of in a market where there are already commercial consolidators getting off the ground. There's the buyout market. There are DB master trusts. Would it be helpful alongside that to have a public sector consolidator? What would that public sector consolidator do? And then finally, the question of, if you're going to have a public sector consolidator, would the PPF be the right body to run it? And I do think those are two separate questions.
Yeah.
So with that, I'll hand over to Shallon.
Yes, thanks, David. And so on this slide, we've just set out, broadly speaking, what the two potential options look like. And it's probably worth adding that, these are not mutually exclusive options. I mean, clearly they're complementary and could sit alongside each other. But they both really fall into the commonality between the two is that we're really talking as an industry about, do we allow schemes to run on for longer, rather than, I guess, the current mantra, which seems to be, we seem to have been moving more towards buyout as the gold standard solution. And I guess the question that we're all discussing is up for debate now is there scope for schemes to run on, and what could that model look like? And so on the left-hand side, there are various participants in the DB pension fund market that are discussing the possibility of schemes running on for longer, and therefore being able to stay invested in, I guess, for want of a better phrase, growth assets. You can call it productive finance or private assets a lot longer, because it matches their cash flow profiles. And then there's all that goes with that, which is, can trustees get themselves comfortable with it? Would sponsors be willing to do it? Would you need, for example, some incentive for sponsors to take that approach? For example, surplus refunds, and how you would create a sort of environment that was conducive to that sort of model. On the right-hand side, you've got obviously the question of consolidation. I mean, you can talk about public consolidator or commercial consolidators. We've already seen that consolidation as a concept has had its challenges in terms of getting off the ground, and we've got just probably one commercial consolidator left in the market as it stands today, and the PPF as a public consolidator. We would envisage it working alongside commercial consolidators. And I guess the reason I say that is because, from our perspective, what we see is there are a fair chunk of smaller pension funds that are struggling to get the appropriate attention of, say, buyout providers or indeed the commercial consolidators. So we think there's some merit in a public consolidator, and effectively allowing pension funds therefore to run on and hold on to the assets for longer. I've set out a number of questions under each model. I don't propose to address all of them. I'll tackle a few of them, which are the more common ones we've received. I guess if I start on the left-hand side, just to probably one overarching comment, the PPF is, certainly, I don't think we've adopted a position which is to suggest that any one option is not viable. I think that's important. We think that both options have challenges, right? So, for example, on the left-hand side, when we talk about pension funds running on in the existing DB pension fund model, we know that one of the challenges is how do we make sure that trustees feel sufficiently comfortable doing that? And the concept has been talked about, the concept of super levy has come up. And again, I think in our response, one of the points that has been made to us is, well, we are overly negative on the cost of that, of that option. I think it's important to understand that in trying to price what that might look like, there are multiple variables. Our response is based on a particular scenario, a particular set of circumstances, and is deliberately conservative, which is not to say the number couldn't be lower or indeed higher. But I think until we have more detail about what that option looks like, it'd be very difficult for us to put out a number. And I think you can all appreciate that the moment you put a number out, that number has the potential to stick. And so we've had to think about, presentationally, how do we approach that with very limited information about what this may ultimately look like. In a similar vein, maybe just to tackle the public consolidator and how would it work with existing models, and which scheme should be considered for entry. I think suffice to say, there is some discussion about what the capital requirements might be for a commercial consolidator, and I think that would be a policy decision to understand where would a public consolidator play in such a way that it didn't cannibalize business that was being targeted by the commercial consolidators. Can they sit alongside each other? Potentially, yes, because they potentially operate in different segments of the market. And that brings me on to entry requirements, where I think, as I said before...
Just before you move on, Shelley, there's a question that's come in from Porrick Floyd, which I just think is worth asking. That's it. From what you've said, it doesn't sound as if there is anyone else in the market who's actually doing this consolidation. So wouldn't this effectively create a public monopoly?
Well, I think that, as you know, there are two consolidators that have been operating historically or have been trying to operate historically in the market. One has recently announced the intention to mothball, and Clara is still very much in the market. So I think the challenge currently for commercial consolidators is that there's been very little clarity on what the regime may look like. And so I think once we have that clarity, we will only then be able to understand who intends to participate and on what basis. So I think it's too early to suggest that there is no market for commercial consolidators. I think commercial consolidators, as I understand the debate, have been frustrated by the lack of clarity on the terms of reference, if you'd like, or the rules of the game.
Porrick, did I properly put your question, or do you want to come in? Okay, answer came there, none. So let's move on. Sorry to butt in like that, Shelley. It will happen again.
Should we come back to the other two questions there, because very, very happy to answer those. But maybe if Shelley goes through the rest of these.
Yeah, look, I was almost done. So all I was going to suggest was, in terms of, again, entry requirements, where we were coming at it was from, we see a lot of pension funds, through the schemes and assessment process, who, from our perspective, have struggled to find a sensible solution. And I think we think that has caused leakage. That's the feedback we get. That's not our opinion, quite frankly. It's feedback we get from our panel of assessors, which is made up of all the usual suspects in the consultant community. So we see some challenges for smaller pension funds, and we think there's scope for for a public consolidator. And it comes back to David's question, and I guess Colin's question: should the PPF have that role? But I think there's absolutely a role there. because I think even the commercial consolidators will acknowledge that the smaller pension funds are probably less of a focus for them, but I don't want to talk on their behalf.
Porrig, have you been able to fix your mic problem, or do you want to come back?
No, that's fine. Thank you, Henry, for flagging it up. I couldn't get my mic to work. Yeah, I just don't see how, if PPF is allowed to enter the market, it will be able to exist alongside any commercial ventures, because you're going to eat their lunch. They're not going to be able to compete. But the thing that the tension here is that we've got a conservative government that could be leading down the road of creating a monopoly, which is something that the free market thinkers within the Tory party will find difficult to swallow. So that's what I was flagging up. So thank you for that, Henry.
Okay, I'm conscious that there are two further questions which you've got, which are both excellent. But allow Shaleen to come back on that point and finish off.
Yeah, I think just to take a step back, I think we've made the assumption that a public consolidator has a government guarantee or a Crown guarantee. I think this talks to Toby's question on the screen. I think the question of whether there's a Crown guarantee or not is, again, is one for policymakers. The point is that if government, if there was a suggestion that investments in a public consolidator were going to be directed, then I think that it's obviously not operating on a standalone basis, and then some sort of government guarantee is probably appropriate. The question of whether it is government guaranteed or not has not yet been decided. So I think a public consolidator may well be set up without a Crown guarantee. Is there any point I'd make?
I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that there was any discussion going on about there being a Crown guarantee behind the Pension Protection Fund. Is that a thing?
Well, I'm just responding really to Toby's question, Henry.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that in the last resort, if you couldn't get levies and you were seriously heading into deficit, the PPF could actually reduce the benefits. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I think, just to make absolutely sure we're talking about the same thing, it's a very clear feature of the existing PPF that legally it doesn't have a government guarantee, and the way that works is the ability to reduce benefits in extremis. And as you know, the board has always taken the view that really is an in extremis thing, rather than we're going to sort of adjust benefits as we go along. So we've stuck to the same benefits for the last 18 years. The question that I think is being raised, which as Toby's just added to the chat, is whether if you were doing a separate consolidator fund, which would be doing something quite different, as in paying full benefits to members, whether and not in the circumstances of insolvency, whether it would be appropriate for that body to have a government guarantee of some kind behind it. But it clearly does raise all the policy issues that you would expect around a Crown guarantee.
I think it's a stretch for many of us to consider the PPF as more than it is right now. If the tax plan stands behind the PPF, then it's no longer a CDC type operation. It's a fully fledged DB scheme, which looks very much like a public sector scheme, which might theoretically be partially unfunded, and the balance being met by the government. That seems to be a very different animal to anything that I'd considered before. But clearly there are views out there that that's the price you'd have to pay for this to be a consolidator. So my question is, do you feel you could be a consolidator without that guarantee?
Well, I think what that then calls into question is where, and probably comes on to Steve's questions about what price would you consolidate at, and if you don't have a guarantee, then you need some form of underwriting. Where does that underwriting come from? I think there is a view out there, or a lot of the feedback to date has been certainly that we've heard anecdotally from schemes and advisors and so on is don't muck about with the existing PPF, and don't muck about with the existing the existing reserves of the PPF. They are there for the purpose of supporting the current mission. So there is that feedback. Now it is possible to think, well, maybe there can be some sort of cross subsidy, particularly if what you're doing by consolidating some of the other schemes is actually reducing the risk to the existing PPF. But it's clearly a significant question. The alternative is presumably how, at what level schemes come into the new consolidator, and how much extra capital they have to bring with them.
Okay. Porry, do you want to move on to your point too? I am conscious there are lots of questions below there from Steve and Toby and whatever, but let's deal with those 3 questions put by Porry to begin with.
All right. Well, I don't want to dominate the questions, but just in you're kind of touching on where I'm going there next. I was making an assumption that you would manage this monies almost on a kind of commercial basis. So you would make a decision on a quasi-commercial basis whether it was something, not because you have to take them in or might need to take them in because the employer's insolvent. So therefore, assuming it was in one fund, how would you manage the culture of having 2 different classes of member, which I think culturally would be difficult? And is there any possibility that any surpluses generated from consolidation would be used to enhance benefits for those in consolidation, those perhaps who've seen their benefits curtailed or limited by insolvency of their employer, or the whole piece? Thank you.
So, the first question around sort of 2 different benefit structures is one that we are super conscious of. So to be clear, I think in the same way that at the moment the PPF, that's technically called the board of the PPF, but the PPF as an organisation manages the PPF, and it administers FAS, and it runs the fraud compensation fund. The what felt like the most logical thing for us would be that we would separately run an entirely legally separate consolidator, and it would be really important, as you say, culturally, to make it clear that if you are coming in as a consolidator, you're coming into a thing that is basically replicating your existing benefits, and sort of rather than it being the lifeboat fund, which is a very different scenario. So I think from our point of view, we probably want to make it actually appear really quite separate on the in terms of the customer facing end of it, to make it really clear what they are getting. The benefits of us doing it rather than anybody else is the fact that behind the scenes, clearly you can use economies of scale, both in terms of how you in terms of how you do the investment and how you administer them. Having now rabbited on, I've forgotten what the last part of that question was.
I can take the second part.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So I think if the second part of the question was could any surpluses that arise in a consolidator be used to augment benefits that were lost as a result of employer insolvency? I think I guess the PPF in of itself provides some sort of blueprint to answer that question, in that what we've seen in the PPF is that it takes a while to build up a level of capital or reserves, which gets you to a position where you can be comfortable that any benefit augmentations will not impact the future financial soundness of the fund. So, so, you know, I think in the PPF's case, for example, we know that benefits have already been reduced, and there are discussions about whether the PPF's benefits are, you know, perhaps need to be augmented in some way, shape, or form. All of those things have a cost, which would deplete reserves, and we have, you know, we have sort of looked at that. What I would say is the theoretical answer to the question is yes. I think it would take many years before it was clear that a surplus had emerged, which would be, or a sufficient surplus had emerged, would allow such a respreading of the surplus. But in theory, I, you know, wouldn't see an issue with that. I'm conscious now some of the questions that have been on the right, Henry, have sort of disappeared, but the question's been asked about benefit standardization. Yes, absolutely. Benefit standardization was absolutely what I was thinking about when I talked about the game of whack-a-mole. That is, there's not going to be any easy answers on benefit standardization. Clearly, the thought of taking on hundreds of schemes with their own benefit structures would create challenges, and therefore benefit standardization may be a route. The question of whether it's, you know, just how much of treacle lies in that route is, you know, is a question for debate. But it's clearly, we've already discussed this with many external parties. It will be a tricky conversation.
We'll come back to that if we can, because I want to just bring in Toby at this stage, and then we'll come back to the standardization question, which is a really important one. Toby, you've got a couple of questions there. Do you want to ask them in person?
Thank you, Henry. So it was, I feel that they've probably been covered to a certain degree, but a lot of the questions have been about the competition between a public consolidator and private consolidators. But a thing that I've always found difficult to understand is how a body of trustees could make that decision between buyout and super fund. Insofar as, I mean, you mentioned that there was a consideration of a government guarantee for the super fund, but even if there was, well, if there wasn't, I think the idea amongst many trustees would be that there'd be a public body, that the government would perhaps stand behind it in some way. And if there was a similar price, I find it kind of hard to think that trustees would choose buyout over super fund. But I was wondering whether thought had been put around that in terms of perhaps structuring slightly different benefits or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the first thing to say is, as David has already explained, if you come into a public consolidator without a government guarantee on day one, you know, there'll be a certain level of capitalization, which, you know, the trustees would have to compare to what they were getting in a buyout. The potential for that public consolidator to then potentially to have to cut benefits at some point in the future if things didn't go according to plan, and potentially with schemes then ending up, you know, in the PPF. So, you know, I think that without the government guarantee, which is, you know, again, certainly possible, there's there is a decision there for trustees. Even with a government guarantee, you could argue that, you know, a public consolidator may be focused on a particular part of the market, and, you know, and that might be the schemes where buyout providers are less interested. I think, and I probably, there's going to be different opinions on this, and we're not going to resolve this particular comment on this call. Certainly, you know, so over the last few weeks, I've had to have multiple conversations with the buyout market, with both consultants, a variety of consultants, as well as the insurance companies themselves. And, you know, contrary, I think, to the narrative that may be out there among some participants, there is a challenge in the smaller end of the buyout market. And I think that we can't shy away from that, and we've seen it firsthand. We have we've actually seen schemes who've not been able to achieve the buyout at satisfactory prices, and we've seen the costs of them trying to achieve that. So in answer to your question, I think the public consolidator may well be focused on a particular segment of the market and leave the buyout providers to focus on a different segment of the market.
I mean, in some of the early discussion around this, there was talk of mandating consolidation into a public sector scheme, and that would obviously take the question out of the trustees' hands. I think that feels less likely as a potential outcome, but it does at least illustrate that all of these really good questions all sort of you kind of have to come up with a straw man solution and then work out the implications of that, because there are so many different moving parts that all change depending on what your core proposition is.
Can I ask on this core proposition thing, because there's an interesting question on this slide. Do these options ultimately deliver on the government's objectives? Now, I would say if you looked at an insurance company buyout, but that's not investing in gilts, it isn't producing anything more than bare minimum member outcomes, and it's certainly not getting you involved in productive finance. So on those three criteria which the government have put out there, the buyout isn't actually achieving those things. Are you saying to government, look, we can do better than buyout?
I think, okay, so just in my opinion, just on the buyouts, there's a few things to keep in mind there. I would say that, and again, trying to be objective here, I think the buyout companies might disagree with that characterization of what they do, and I would be sympathetic to their viewpoint. I think they do invest in productive finance. That's the first point I'd make. I think the second point is there are certain changes in Solvency II which are being proposed, which would allow them to potentially increase the investment in productive finance. Yes, if you're critical of it, you might say it might not do enough, but there are changes around just how predictable the cash flows need to be. So I think that will improve the situation. So I don't think we are saying that the buyout providers are not playing their role. I think we're saying there's a way in which, back to my earlier comment, I think both the proposals are saying there's a way in which schemes can run on for longer. Potentially, it may mean that in a very worst case scenario, we hold on to productive finance in the pension fund ecosystem for longer than might otherwise be the case, versus if those pension funds transfer to a Solvency II, even an adjusted Solvency II regulated regime.
I'm going to come to Steve Hodder's points, and then I'm going to come to you, David, because I know that your points right out them. Steve, do you want to just articulate what you're saying in comments, or have you got further questions you want to ask at this stage?
Yeah, thanks, Henry. I think there's, just to be clear, I think there's a lot to be said for the PPF adopting a public service role as I see it, because the truth is there's hundreds, if not thousands, of subscale DB schemes, and being frank, the buyout providers don't really want them, and the commercial consolidators probably don't really want them. So if there's a route for those schemes to be better managed, the assets pooled, and maybe even deliver on the Chancellor's objectives, then so be it. I think there are just some big complexities as to how that will work. If there's enough policy intent, then those complexities can be solved, but there are some challenges. I mean, the challenges I put in the chat are, firstly, price. There's the big question: does the PPF charge a market price for these schemes? And hence, to Toby's point, if a buyout costs the same, how do they choose between the two? Or is there actually an intention that they would come in at whatever funding level they currently have, which I think was maybe at one point being mooted by the Tony Blair Institute, and that obviously raises difficult questions of fairness for the companies that have funded their schemes properly, in inverted commas. Why do these schemes get to walk away at a lower funding level? And standardization, I think, is a nigh on impossible question, because we can all come up with an actuarially fair way of standardizing benefits, but there will be members, by definition, there will be members who do better out of that, and there'll be members who do worse. And in our minds, it only takes one or two members to do worse, and then you've got your Daily Mail headlines of this change happening and Mrs. McGee losing out because, as it happens, that she didn't fit the assumptions. And the other question, which I think is interesting, is if the PPF's able to standardise benefits to get this off the ground, why can't insurers? Because we can all buy an annuity on our phone of standardised benefits, and one of the bottlenecks for smaller schemes must be the administrative burden of the insurers underpinning all these different types of benefit structures. So should that standardisation process be allowed for insurers and commercial consolidators, which would possibly remove the need for a public consolidator? So a number of difficulties, but back to my earlier comment, if there's policy desire to make something like this work, then I'm sure it can be made to work.
David, have you got anything to add before we put that to our colleagues? You're on mute, but you're shaking your head as if you haven't.
No, I think Steve's covered points on standardisation. I was going to raise the other issue I had was around the scope of the potential PPF role, where it's been talked today about it may be targeted on a particular segment of the market. The PPF submission is sort of fairly bullish and says, we could take the smallest 4,500 schemes, which is, I don't know, 80% or so of all schemes in the universe, and I guess it's not clear precisely where the line is drawn, whether that's based on number of members, size of assets, but that's going to be something well over 1,000 member scheme, well over 100 million scheme in terms of asset value, where that cut-off point would be. And I guess the questions that raises are, firstly, a good chunk of those schemes, I think about 40% or so, but I haven't checked the Purple Book, have still got ongoing accrual or did at the Purple Book date. Yeah, so for you to take them all, are you assuming that they all close fairly quickly? Obviously, that would be encouraged by the government's proposal yesterday that any scheme under 10,000 members that doesn't consolidate gets fined £10,000 a year for a different general levy structure. But also, how does that fit with the gateway for commercial consolidators? Because if you're drawing the line that high, not all of these schemes are tiny ones who can't find a buyout provider. And maybe if there's a government guarantee, you can say that the logic for the gateway falls away because PPF consolidation won't be less secure than buyout. But it seems to me you're assuming, when you sell to the government, this is what a great job we could do for public finance, you're assuming that you get a lot of schemes which would have to close, or schemes which could potentially buy out in other cases.
Have you got all those questions written down?
Shall I start with a couple of general points, and then I suspect you probably got some thoughts on the funding and so on. I mean, I think I really liked the way Steve put it about the kind of the policy thing. I think, or policy appetite, if you like, there are real challenges with this stuff. So benefit standardisation being one that we've talked about quite a lot. So I think it does, exactly as Steve said, kind of boil down to, does everybody look at it and go, well, this would all be a lovely idea, but there are so many bits that it's all in the too difficult box and give up, or does something that helps to move the dial as part of a bigger picture emerge out of this? I think the one point which I think came up on the question of but effectively of sponsor covenant, which I guess is the same question about what kind of level do schemes come in. Again, I think there are different options there, but if we were, if the consolidator was taking on, let's say, smaller schemes which are typically more underfunded and so on, or the sort of the stressed schemes, the schemes that are never going to get there, we've have done some thinking around the idea that the employer covenant would be broken but replaced by an obligation to pay fixed payments for until the deficit was made up. So changing the kind of risk structure there, and then you have the question of, okay, but what happens if the employer goes bust in the meantime? Do you then flip that? Do you flip that legacy scheme into normal PPF, like as would happen now, or do they get their benefits reduced in PPF2 or whatever? So that I think there are options there, and they would be things that would be that would have to be thrashed out depending on what the scenario is and which schemes you are looking to take on. I guess I mean and again to make the broader point, yes, we do think that in principle we could take on those 4,500 schemes. There's no sort of capacity constraint as such. Certainly not on the investment side. As we alluded to earlier on, in terms of transferring schemes in, we have done it. We've worked hard in our existing structure to get schemes in quickly and find ways of doing that. That would still be quite a step change to the sort of scale that we'd be talking about here, but we do think there are probably ways of doing it differently, and it is a slightly different context when you're doing it with a live scheme rather than picking through the wreckage of a recent insolvency. But yeah, the 4,500 schemes number, I think I'm right in saying, yes, it's a large proportion of the schemes, but because of the new distribution, I think it's about 15% of assets overall. So it's still a small proportion of the overall market. It would be about 200 billion of assets, I believe. But I think and David's just put the question in how quickly could we do 4,500 schemes? I mean, we've looked at it. It would be a matter of years, clearly. But the 4,500 is clearly an upper limit as well. It's more just a question of saying, look, don't assume that things have to be exactly as they are now. Did you want to talk about sort of funding levels and so on?
Yeah, I think just to add on the terms of transfer. So you've probably read, I think in July, the sort of paper which came out from DWP around commercial super funds and capital adequacy and terms of transfer there. So, and I think there what was talked about was calibrating it to a 2% probability of the consolidator having to enter the PPF. So if you sort of go on that basis, I wouldn't imagine a public consolidator doing anything different to sort of, calibrating the assumptions to make sure that they were sufficiently prudent to ensure that there was a 98% chance that the scheme doesn't have to go into the PPF, which broadly I think comes out at, a sort of gilts plus a half, gilts plus 75 or some sort of basis around there. So yeah, we wouldn't be proposing that the basis be any different to what's being proposed for the terms of transfer on a commercial consolidator.
Yeah, well, that poses some interesting competition questions, doesn't it? Andy Young, is it okay if I call you? Because I mean, you're the guy who set this thing up. You made some interesting comments in there. Or would you like me just to put your point across? Do you want to come off mute?
You go ahead, Eddie. Not Eddie, sorry, Henry.
Don't confuse me with Eddie.
I was dreaming.
Right. If government does give some sort of guarantee for a PPF2 consolidator, as you're proposing, might be the case, and however this is assessed, wouldn't any profit go to the government if a guarantee is for full scheme benefits? In other words, rather than paying out surplus, you're going to be paying back to the government for the risk it's taking, us taxpayers, that is. I hope I've asked your question correctly, Andy.
Yeah, that's great. I was perhaps I could just say I was thinking of Royal Mail in that context, or British Coal rather, where there is a profit sharing agreement because government is giving an undertaking when it took in the assets. So there are many ways in which the provision of something from government could be shared or all go to government. It's a question of design. As Steve said, once we set out the framework and the way this works, the technicalities can be worked through, I'm sure. It's really making sure that we get the policy intention right. And I think that's the hard bit.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the answer to the question, as I think you've already alluded to, Andy, is that I think it's premature to say what the terms of any guarantee would be. We've alluded to one potential contingency, which is that the government gives the guarantee because it wants to determine the way in which assets are directed. Now, appreciate that's, that may not sound palatable given, sort of global history around prescribed investments. It's a very sensitive topic, and so I accept that point. But yeah, I think it's whether the surplus is then refunded comes down to what the terms of the under which terms are the guarantee given. I think just to finish off on Steve's point around terms of transfer, I think one of his other questions was, what happens if schemes are underfunded? Or that's my interpretation of the question, Steve, is that what happens if schemes are underfunded? Do you just take them in, or is there some sort of, recovery plan which has to be agreed? The way I've thought about it so far is that it would be under the basis of some sort of a recovery plan being agreed. Not on the basis that you would take on, any sort of underfunded scheme. Sorry, just wanted to clarify that.
Could I move on to John Quinlivan? John, you had a couple of points which are rather sort of opaque in the way you put them. Perhaps you'd like to open up.
Well, I get a few thoughts. Clearly the pension scheme environment is a mark-to-model environment, and the insurance regime is broadly a mark-to-market. This feels like a mark-to-minister regime, which I'm just thinking about the whole. You got FSCS challenges in terms of is there the protection there? Is the covenant broken or not? We've got the whole question of benefit unification or whatever the term is, and the moral hazard issues in terms of competition law, government crown guarantee, and so on. I think there's a hell of a lot of work to be done here to really get through the economics and the numbers. And certainly, I think if I was a trustee and the 2% chance of going into the PPF1 versus PPF2, I'd be looking at those buyout numbers and trying to compare and contrast, because someone's. And the final point, Henry, you talked about productive capital. Let's not forget, and I'm not an apologist for the insurers, but let's not forget that there's a lot of debt capital that goes into markets from the insurers, and sponsors or companies need equity capital and debt capital. It's not productive in the same way, but it is capital that goes in.
Absolutely. So if I just start with that one, I mean, that is exactly why I push back on the suggestion that the buyer providers are not doing productive finance, because I think the buyer, I would, having sort of worked for a company that owns a buyer provider, I would disagree with that characterization. So I have, we take no exception with that. In terms of the covenant, I think we would envisage the covenant would be broken, but if there is a deficit, clearly the sponsor stays on the hook for the deficit, but there's the scope to potentially reduce benefits if the deficit recovery plan is not met. And I've forgotten what the middle point was.
FSCS.
FSCS, yeah.
I mean, I think, I mean, again, that's a design question. To be honest, I don't think we'd really seen FSCS as being involved. If anybody was going to be involved, it would presumably be PPF1. If you had some mechanism for schemes to flip out of the public sector consolidator and into PPF in some, but it does entirely depend how you set it up.
Yeah, one way or another, somebody ends up paying, and the fiscus way is basically throwing it back on advisors and insurers. It's kind of like it's a difficult one, isn't it?
Can I just add one more thing, if I may? Is the point was made by John about it's very difficult. There's a lot of work and a lot of thinking to be done about this. I would say that the entire, the runoff of the small schemes in the DB universe, if you were to look at the cumulative amount of effort that's going to be needed to run off those schemes, effectively what we're doing is we're taking the PV or the present value of all of that work and sort of trying to condense it as potentially. When I say we are doing this, I say as an industry, by having this discussion now, what we are effectively doing is saying, we know there are some difficult conversations that lie ahead for smaller DB pension funds. Can we as an industry find a way now to have these, to effectively have all of these discussions up front in a way which is more efficient for the next, 50 years of runoff. So I think if you were to compare and contrast, as if we could continue to operate as we are, I don't think on a cumulative basis you'd reduce the amount of effort that's going to go into running off the DB universe. That's my opinion.
Okay, thanks very much. Connor's arrived and he's got a question. Do you want to just? I'm not ignoring your later questions, Steve. I just don't think we're going to be able to cover them on this session, especially with regard to the time situation. But Con, do you want to ask your question quickly?
Sure, yeah. In fact, I have a number of questions.
No, you can't have a number of questions. We've only got 2 minutes.
The first question then is, why is this presentation about could the PPF become a consolidator? Surely the question should have been, should the PPF be considering being a consolidator? There's a related question, which is all of the lobbying which has gone on here has been paid for by the PPF. How is that consistent with their current statutory position? I don't see any justification for them doing that. There's a couple of questions.
Shall I jump in with that? And I might as well. No, I was going to do you one on screen, but I think as we're running out of time. I mean, obviously, in my role as General Counsel of the PPF, I'm pretty concerned about, what is it appropriate for us to do and what's it not appropriate for us to do, given our current mandate. Where we see ourselves is as a source of information. We've obviously got quite a lot of information, insight into what's going on, expertise around the place that we can offer. As I said in my sort of introductory comments at the beginning, the sort of noise level on this has definitely turned up a fair bit compared with where things normally are, and that is leading to us ending up coming on discussions like this. But it is very much in the context of, look, here's some facts, some information, some thoughts that are sort of around the edge of what we do at the moment. But it's for other people to decide, and any kind of, okay, now you're going to start building things or actually spending money and so on is a question for further down the line if there is a policy decision to do some of this stuff.
Okay, thank you. Con, do you want to come back on that? I'm conscious there's another question from Peter You always seem to get
Well, I think that what we're seeing is explicit lobbying, not the provision of information to people. Sorry, that's my view.
Well, that's not where we're positioning ourselves. We are definitely speaking.
Oh, so can I quote you as saying you don't want to be a consolidator?
As I said at the beginning, I think there's that there is and has been for years a feeling around the place that there are other things that the PPF as an organisation could be put to. So from that point of view, I think we think it might be a wasted opportunity if it isn't.
Your role, that's as may be. The fact is that your role is limited by what was set by Parliament, and it does not include considering that.
I think on that, if you take that to its logical extreme, then we probably shouldn't be responding to industry consultations and on anything. And I think it's appropriate for us to do that. We are not in the world of lobbying. We are making a bit more noise on this one on the basis that there is a lot of noise generally, and you won't be heard unless you unless you make your position clear. And I think it's probably worth saying that some of the feedback we've had is people saying it's nice that the PPF have said what they really think for once. So
yeah, and I mean, the point of having you on this call is for you to say what you really think, and I think everyone is in agreement. But you've actually said what you think, which is great. And there's some great comments in there, which we're not going to necessarily be able to get to on this call from various people. Peter, I'm sorry, we're just timed out, but please, before, as we're saying our bye-byes, can everyone just have a look at the kind of comments which are coming in at the very end, because it's very, very important that we capture that stuff, and sadly we'll lose it when we call to close on this. It is the end, and I've got to go. And if you guys can stay behind and have a chat with Steve, it'll be great, because he likes to do a quick 1-minuter. I'm going to wrap the session up for everyone else and say thank you very much to the PPF for coming on and being so clear about what they want to do. Can we thank them either with emojis or with a raise of hands? Okay.
Thanks. Thank you for having us. Thanks for joining.
We haven't got a speaker for next week, but I'm busy doing something about that right now. Can we pray for peace in the East? It's a long time it's been going on, but we do it every week, and hopefully one day we won't have to do it. And finally, thanks very much to everyone for turning up today and for what's been an excellent discussion. And with that, I'll wish you goodbye.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Henry.
Enjoy the
Thanks,
rest of your day. The video will be available this afternoon. So there we are.
Yeah.
So yeah, and Shellin and Dave, if you could just stay on for 30 seconds, that'd be great. So be wonderful. Thanks. And thanks everybody for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Henry. So David and Shellin, thank you very much indeed for that. That was a fantastic session. Multiple questions, multiple opinions, and yeah, some good, some bad. But what does the industry want to achieve? What does the PPF want to achieve? And I think you did really, really well. And I think it's a good advocate for change. And as you said, one of the big themes in there, of course, was the big insurers don't want the smaller sort of buyout opportunities, and the consolidators maybe don't want the same thing either. So it could actually be a fantastic public service in that respect, So and you're not going to get agreement for every part of the industry, but there's a lot to be done, and I really, really appreciate your input, your presentation, your thoughts. It was very professional, and I hope you got something out of it. What we usually do is spend 1 minute, just a summary from your side of things. What was it about? What do you want to achieve? And what's the next step? David or Shannon, do you want to pick up that and just do a little summary?
I just want to check. Maybe Padraig has some final questions that he wanted to put to us.
Yeah.
Padraig, do you have any questions for us?
He may just have. Hang on, let me just. Yeah, he may have gone. So, yeah, I think Padraig's gone and Trish.
Trish is one of ours.
Yeah, so
All right,
push out.
Sean.
So there we go. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
no, just literally 1 minute. What hopefully you enjoyed the session. What's the summary of it, and what are the challenges ahead? What do you think, Shailin?
Yeah. So first question, is there a way to capture all the questions? We've got
Yeah.
Okay,
I'll send you the
perfect, lovely.
transcript and
Sorry,
I'll send you the
I thought Henry said the questions will be lost when we
Yeah.
cut the call. Okay,
No.
all right, that's good.
Yeah,
Look,
hopefully.
it's really, as you know, Steve, it's really difficult to be a speaker and judge how it came across. And so I'd be more interested in your comments, as to how you felt it came across, because it's clearly number one, a difficult topic. There's lots of unknowns, and we're talking about. I mean, these are some really big, hairy issues that we're really trying to grapple with here, and it's I would suspect it's amongst the most complex challenges that we face in pensions, and we're trying to all sort of tackle them all in one go, if you'd like. So I felt it went okay, but I'd really keen on your thoughts as an observer, how you thought it came across.
Yeah, no, I think you put your comments and your strategy forward very, very well. And there's always going to be disgruntlement. There's going to be one hand positivity because UK PLC need help. Small, medium, large companies need help in that space. And if you can help, then great. Other people would say, well, is it an unfair advantage? Is it anti-competitive? You're just gonna create those those feelings, and yeah, it's a subjective thing, isn't it? It's subjective. So you then have the added layer of if you imagine you're an LCP, a Hyman's, a First, an XPS, or a Barnett Waddingham advising a board of trustees. How does that look in 12 months' time, or 2 years' time? We've got a quote from Rothsay Life, we've got a quote from Aviva or whoever, Widows, or M&G have just entered the market, as you know, probably on buyout. And by the way, here's the PPF2 quote. So if you're a trustee, you're maybe a little bit like a rabbit in the headlights, and and by that time, the advisors, and this has got to help the advisory community. Is it like a buyout? Do they get 100%? If you get an M&G, 100% buyout, non-profit deferred annuity, guaranteed as the day is long, full stop. Or PPF2, maybe it's a 95% guarantee. I don't know. You may not. There might be a pulling back of benefits if levies can't be raised. So part of this has also got to be about helping the advisory community and the trustees. Some of the trustees, as you know, are either professional. Some of them are going to be sole going forward. You're going to get lay trustees, member nominated trustees. For them, put yourselves in their shoes. What would they like to see from a PPF2 style proposition? Because ultimately, it will have to go head to head with the traditional buyout community, the buy-in buyout community. So, if you can, I mean, maybe that's another strategy as well, is to put yourself out there to the more to the advisory community and maybe the trustee community, with understanding what PPF2 would look like. Let's call it PPF2. I don't know, but I think it's really interesting. And you are going to get very, very positive feedback and some negative. So, but David, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I mean on the discussion as a whole, I think what was in some ways reassuring was that there are a lot of questions there, the vast majority of which are things that we've sort of gone around the houses on, and it does just illustrate that actually, I think there's a reason that it was set up as a call for evidence, that actually there's obviously a really wide range of things that could be done, and until somebody puts some sort of line in the sand, then it ends up being a very wide-ranging discussion, and it's for somebody else to put that line in the sand. It feels as though it feels closer to something happening than it has done for a long time, but we know that there's it's very exciting to be thinking about pensions and what's going on in the DB world from our viewpoint in Croydon, but it is part of a much bigger ecosystem and a political system and all the rest of it. So you don't know what will ultimately make it through. But we think there's some good, some good could be done.
if I had a magic wand, I think, what it would look like, who knows, but I think something possibly will come of this. That's possibly where I think it's going. So this is good work and good strategy. I think it's a very interesting development from your point of view, and you've done so well in the years that the PPF have been going. Providing that lifeboat, and admin's been great, investment's been great, your assumptions have been great. Long may that continue. PPF 1, yes. PPF 2, well, why not? As you said, Shailene, I think in the presentation, there's not exactly a whole line of consolidators queuing up. We know about Clara, we know what's happened on pension super fund. There's not 10 or 20 firms queuing up to say, hey, let's get into this market. So if they're not, who is? And that's possibly where you come in, I guess. So great work, absolutely brilliant work, and I really, really appreciate your time. And I'll send you the attendees, and I'll try and get your transcript as well with all the questions and that sort of stuff, just to help. So
perfect. Oh, that'd be great. Thanks, Steve.
Really appreciate your input.
No, well, thank you. No, thanks for having us on. We really appreciate it. Look forward to the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want to talk about anything else on another day, then come to me or Henry, and 3 or 6 months time, whenever you want to shout about something new or something different, then come to us. We're very happy to promote. So appreciate that. Appreciate your time, and
thanks,
enjoy
Steve.
the rest of your day. And
thank you too. Cheers.
Thanks a
Bye
lot.
now.
Take care. Cheers. Bye. Bye.